So, I want to start by saying that when I discovered that this was going to be a straight procedural debate, I initially rolled my eyes. However, I thought that this was an incredible debate, even though it was a procedural one, because I think that both sides did a very good job at sort of explaining how the online format has differences that may affect the way in which we would judge things in relation to topicality or procedurals in general. But I think that what was also good is that it wasn't just about the online format, but that there was the fundamentals that was built into topicality on both sides that I think that both teams did a good job on. I ultimately vote for the proposition, and the reason why I vote for the proposition is twofold. The first reason is that I don't think that the opposition does a good job of explaining in the last speech why the ground that you want, this, the essentially alternative agent counterplan, is ground that should be negative ground. And I think that it would be helpful if in your initial speech you use definitions to explain how UN resolutions don't actually include other actors, such as like China or the United States. And I think that something the proposition should do is that they should also be reading evidence that explains how resolutions issued by the UN requires member states to oftentimes do something, right? Which means that it wouldn't be extra topical at all in the world where there's actually definitions that indicate that this would be something that a UN resolution decrying would actually require other nations to do. However, I think the opposition should also be reading evidence in the other direction. And the reason why I think that this is important gets to sort of the second issue is that if it is not negative ground, then because it doesn't necessarily disprove the resolution, why is it unfair for the proposition to have included this extra plank to their plan? And I think that the reason why this becomes important is something that's mentioned in the proposition speech, is that if you were to run that counterplan, it's not competitive with a affirmative that would just have the UN denounce, right? It's like if one actor acts, then another actor can act simultaneously, which could just generate better solvency. So you need to create better competition and show how it's mutually exclusive. And this is why having a definition that shows that the UN is mutually exclusive with other actors, and that they're two different avenues, or a disadvantage to how that constructs, then that would be good. So that instead of just saying, well, the proposition stole our ground because we couldn't run this counterplan, it's the proposition stole our ground because we couldn't run this counterplan, and this is a good counterplan because this author, this evidence, this reason for why it's important to talk about the different agents who could take action is absolutely imperative. And so that gives you, there's two reasons to why that's important. The first reason is that it means that it's good for fairness. It's ground that the negative should have, and then it's divided in the debate based upon the contextual literature base that defines what a UN resolution entails. And second, it gives you that second standard that I mentioned in the comments section, which is that you need to essentially show why you're also being educational, right? And that's something that the proposition has in their speech, is that the proposition makes the arguments for why what they did in the initial speech had educational value, and then that one extra sentence is not so unfair where I should just disregard everything else. If you have on the opposition side, when running topicality, arguments for why what they do is bad for education, which would be the piece of evidence or the argument that shows the exclusivity between the agent and the agent that you're proposing in the alleged counterplan and the agent that the affirmative uses, that would give you that traction again to sort of show how what you're doing is educational. When the debate is deprived that makes it particularly hideous because it destroys a key avenue for discussion, which is important to understand how to do things like stop the dolphin hunt. But absent that, it becomes a reason why I don't think that the ground that you get is necessarily always opposition ground, even though I do think that the alternative agent counterplan is opposition ground in the way the resolution is phrased. And secondly, that it wouldn't compete as a counterplan, right? And if you had the debate, you would have had a disad to go along with it. Then you would be good. And I think that what would complement your strategy is what you do in the initial speech where you run the counterplan, essentially, right? Is that you give a procedural argument and then the agent counterplan that you have always wanted, which should then have the embedded disadvantage to why the UN works. And so your counterplan would still function because you could pick out of the UN portion of the resolution and say that the affirmative has it right except for the part where they say the UN has to act, and then that's still bad, and then you can still win on the counterplan you want to win on because the agents acting alone, China and the United States acting alone, is better than having them act with the UN, which is reasons for why the counterplan is mutually exclusive with the plan, and also reasons for then why, if that's true, you don't need the procedural argument to be able to get your ground. So I think that the initial opposition speech would be benefited by cutting down the length of the procedural argument, having the procedural argument, counterplan, and then a disadvantage to UN action, and that gives the proposition more to cover, and then your last opposition speech you can either go for the procedural argument or just go for the counterplan disadvantage. And if you can't go for the counterplan disadvantage, you then have concrete examples of where abuse takes place on the flow, where you can say this was where we lost fairness, this is where we couldn't have this educational debate. And I think that you do a good job of pointing out that he is more or less conceding the fact that they are extratopical, and so it's not that you need to prove that there is a violation that takes place. What you have missing in this debate is proving where that violation is so bad where it makes it impossible for you to compete, or so bad where it makes it educational meaningless. And I think that citing evidence or using citations within the citation field for evidence, which could be standard debate authors on why certain educational practices or things like extratopicality are bad, would help you be able to build up the educational portions of this impact. Again, I think that it was a good debate by both sides. If either you have questions, you could feel free to email me, or you could just leave comments in the comments section, and I will respond when I see that there is a note attached to it. Alright, thanks for debating. It was great hosting you, and I love that you were participants in this format. Thank you.